it's interesting that he might be this Machiavellian kind of figure, Huw Edwards, and several others who have gotten to the top. There's been so many stories. I mean, of course, in America, Harvey Weinstein, of course.
They have to have a strong element of Machiavellianism to have made it, have the dark side and to cover it up so well so that people don't see it. That's the point I'm trying to make.
There was a fellow who interviewed Tom Cruise as well in the States. I forgot his name right now. Oh, what was his name? And he got in loads of trouble as well. Bollocks. Hang on, I'm looking this up. Psychology, Tom Cruise, Matt Lauer, he got in all sorts of trouble, similar kinds of thing that he was getting up to. The reason I mentioned psychopath with regards to Huw Edwards is he obviously was taking some big risks. I mean, it ended up, that was one kid you were talking about, or 17-year-old. Then there's a guy who I think is 25 who was supplying him with images and just sending him these photos. And at one point, Huw Edwards says, "Don't send me anything illegal," I believe he said. But at the same time, it was hundreds of photos, many of which were underage, as young as 7 years old. So obviously he knew what was going on. So I wonder to what extent this is somebody, he must have known this is going to get out. He can't trust this 25-year-old weirdo who's sending him horrible images.
Well, that's a very, very good question. Again, we're trying to understand behavior that seems to be self-destructive or counterproductive, which is at the heart of what, to some extent, psychiatry is. We have to think about what it is that leads people to self-destruction. So going back to the images, the second part of the Huw Edwards case is a second thing that happened. The first part of the case had been dropped because the police said there was no criminal activity, the boy was 17, etc., etc. Then the second thing that happened, and I think it was the police force in Wales, was dealing with someone who they discovered had sent images to Huw Edwards, and that's how he got uncovered. And there were 41 images, and 7 of which are called Category A, which is the most serious element. So you're asking a good question, which is how come people are blind to the risks? And there's several possible answers. Going back to the fact that sex in particular has a very strong compulsive drive to it. So there's a force behind it. When people are compelled or suffering from a compulsion, they will tend to move into the territory of taking more and more risks. And the more risks they take and then they get away with it, they begin not to see the escalation of risk, so that inevitably in the end they take too many risks and they get uncovered. So there's the compulsive push into the territory of risk that may partly explain it. The second thing, of course, with famous people is they're insulated by agents and lawyers, and they've usually often been bailed out by their fame, people turning a blind eye, being lauded, overly praised, love-bombed, if you could say, by the management. So they don't see the management as a threat. And the final point, and this certainly happened with Jimmy Savile, is a view that who's going to believe them? I am who I am, and everyone loves me. Who's going to believe them if they hear something a bit dodgy? Usually they'll think, oh, is it really possible that this wonderful person who raised all this money for charity, in the case of Jimmy Savile, is this vile criminal? Or is the person making the allegation possibly got a screw loose, etc., etc.? So I think that feeds into the narcissism again, that people will think I'm wonderful and find it very difficult to believe these things. Right. So there's all sorts of reasons why people engage in risk, and as they get away with it, take more and more risks.
Interesting. And then what would you, as a celebrity psychiatrist, as in psychiatrist to the celebrities, not a famous psychiatrist yourself. No, you're both a celebrity psychiatrist. What would you, if Huw Edwards called you now, I gather is he in prison already? I don't know.
No, he's not in prison.
So he's just in his house.
Yeah. Well, I think he's broken up from his wife. The newspaper accounts are that he's separated from his wife and he's living in a flat separately. I think that's what the newspaper accounts are at the moment.
Would it happen that he would be calling someone like you, come over, please? And then how do you even begin picking up the pieces? What do you do? Or do you even feel like, I don't want to help you, mate, given what you've been up to?
Well, I have dealt with people who have been in a media spotlight and a media frenzy, but the people I've dealt with have not committed a criminal act. And I think there is a sense in which that would be difficult. However, often it would be the case that with someone like this person we're discussing, because there was one of the reasons the BBC said they dealt with the case they did was I think they had legal letters indicating the person was suffering from a mental illness, and that became part of the reason why they dealt with it a certain way. So obviously at that time they must have been had a professional who wrote a letter of some description. One has to surmise. But you're asking a very good question, which is how do people deal with extreme adversity? And in this case, loss of the thing that made your life meaningful, which is you were very famous. Now there's an inversion. You're notorious. You're infamous. And I think that is a very difficult thing to cope with. But I think it is possible to cope with extreme losses. I've dealt with people who've dealt with the loss of vast fortunes. They were worth 500 million and then something happened and now they're worth nothing and so on and so forth. But loss, coping with loss is part of what psychiatry helps people with. They have to ultimately be able, cut a very long story, I'm cutting to the chase. There are lots of other steps along the way, but finally they've got to be able to replace the thing that made life meaningful with something else. You and I were bantering a bit about tennis, right?
Off air before, yeah.
If you have to give up millions of pounds and a career, you might get obsessed with tennis, etc., etc. You've got to replace something and replace it with something else.
Yeah, with him, it's going to be prison, though, isn't it? That's what he's going to replace his career with.
Not necessarily. We don't know. We don't know.
He's pleaded guilty, hasn't he, to having those images?
Yeah, okay. But the person, for example, who sent the images has received a suspended sentence.
Oh.
I think, according to the press.
I don't know if we come down hard enough on the. I mean, especially a guy sending those images.
Yeah, but you see my point. If the person who sent the images got a suspended sentence, I'm not entirely convinced the person who received them.
That's why I say we don't come down hard enough.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not.
Legally.
I don't know. But anyway, my point is, it's possible. But even it is. I mean, it is possible to survive extreme adversity. The way that you're raising the question, with a slight, which is understandable, slight note of incredulity, you think there's some things that are impossible to survive, and I don't agree with that. I think it's possible to survive anything and everything. However, you do have to want to survive, and you have to have a reason to survive. If you've lost your wife, which is what may have happened in this case, and maybe your family, maybe you begin to run out of reasons. But generally speaking, you need a reason to survive, and if you have a reason, then you can survive with the right help in terms of developing coping skills.